Women's basketball has been played historically different than the men's, dating back to its literal invention. It was meant to be PE or some physical exertion, but kept extremely ladylike. Spelled basket-ball at the time. Genius name. They were playing with a basket and a ball. The first recorded game for women's basketball was played with wet paper bags, and the first official collegiate game ended with a score of 2-1. I know, right? But let's break down what they were actually playing. James Naismith invented the game of basketball in 1891. Cinda Berenson introduced and adapted the rules for women at Smith College in 1892. By 1893, Clara Bear was introducing similar rules to Sophie Newcomb College. In 1895, Clara Bear did write the first book of rules for women's basketball. I use both their names because there were no standards for women's basketball, and their schools played very different versions of the same game. Cinda Berenson's defined rules and dedication would lead her to being referred to as the mother of basketball. Her guidelines for basketball would be used up until the 1960s. She defined a game played 9-on-9, played on a court split into 3 zones. It was like a soccer-basketball hybrid baby, where players were not allowed to leave their zones and were meant to pass and score with soccer in mind, but with basketball in hand. The idea was physical activity without too much competition. There was an actual rule against guarding other players, and they weren't even allowed to dribble until 1913. April of 1896 showed a quick reception to the new sport, with Stanford and the University of California, Berkeley playing a game of 9-on-9 women's basketball. Stanford did win the game 2-1, but it showed how popular the sport was becoming, with the first game in high school and the first game in Australia being recorded in 1897. And during this time, Clara Bear's book was making its rounds and doing some work to standardize the game, but all schools weren't going by the same rules. With the sport gaining so much popularity, it had a lot of eyes on it. And at this time, it wasn't very ladylike for women to play sports in general, let alone basketball. So a lot of colleges and schools took Stanford's lead and banned women's intercollegiate sports altogether. During this time, all college play and high school play was suspended, but players that enjoyed the game formed independent clubs. Stanford changed their mind in 1904, allowing women to compete again, and of course, the other schools followed suit. In 1906, they were on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, which again just shows how popular the sport itself had become at the time. So now they were officially allowed to play, and all the schools were pretty much using Berenson's rules and guidelines as she put forth on the game. It did turn into a 6-on-6 instead of 9-on-9.
And in 1934, girls started playing a 2-court 6-on-6 game that put 3 forwards and 3 guards on each side of a center line they weren't allowed to cross. All players were limited to 2 dribbles, and only forwards could shoot the ball.
So 12 players was a lot less chaotic, and it made the game move faster. With only 2 zones, it was a lot less crowded and the fans could get into the game. I can't imagine what else they were allowed to do to have fun back then, so this had to be exciting. So they played with these initial rules, these archaic rules, these original rules to keep them ladylike for a while there. It wasn't until 1913 that they were allowed to dribble, a single dribble, as long as it was only knee high. So we were still very far off from the game we know today. There were no crossovers. In 1914, half-court play is allowed, and they were playing some great basketball, as defined by their day. A Canadian high school team known as the Edmonton Grads had a record of 502-20. It was over a 25-year span, but James Naismith himself would call them the finest basketball team that ever stepped on a floor. In 1918, they saw a couple of rule changes. The bottom of the basket was removed, substitutions were allowed for the first time, but if you were subbed out, you couldn't come back into the game, and they allowed the bounce pass for the first time. In the 1920s, women's basketball was played at the Women's Olympiad, which was basically just a 5-day multi-sport event centered around women. In 1926, the AAU sponsored the first ever American National Women's Basketball Championship, and in 1927, they actually got numbers on their jerseys, but only on the back though. In 1924 and 1928, women's basketball was played at the Olympics as an exhibition sport, and it would be almost 50 years until it was made permanent at the Olympics. With each rule change, Barrington updates the guide, keeping and setting a standard. Things get interesting in the 30s because in 1932, they're allowed to guard another player. FIBA is formed in Geneva. In 1936, they introduce a rule. For the first time, a guard was allowed to play the entire court. They were referred to as rovers. This same year, the All-American Redheads team, a barnstorming professional team, was formed. Barnstorming refers to a practice where sports teams travel to various locations to play exhibition matches, often to promote the sport and generate revenue. This approach was popular in the early days of professional sports. They played by men's rules and were very successful with their audiences. They were so successful as an exhibition team that they fostered two other teams, the Ozark Hillbillies and the famous Redheads. So you kind of want to think of them like the first Harlem Globetrotters, but for women. In 1938, they officially decided to divide the court into two sections rather than three. So instead of playing 9-on-9, they were now playing 6-on-6. In 1947, they had their numbers on the front and the back of their jerseys. In 1949, they were allowed 2 bounce dribbles. Continuous dribble was still experimental and not fully adopted yet. Also in 1949, you saw the emergence of the Arkansas Travelers, owned by Hazel Walker. Just like the Redheads, they were a professional women's basketball team that traveled around doing exhibition games. They didn't belong to a league or anything, but this team was different because it was owned by Hazel Walker, one of the biggest names in women's basketball at the time. To play professionally, this is how you had to play. The biggest difference here was she wasn't really a fan of the gimmicks, but she did understand that that's what brought the fans in. The first half of the game, she would have a lot of gimmicks, and then the second half of the game, she would take it very seriously. They won a very high percentage of their games playing men the entire time. She would retire in 1965 at the age of 50. From 1945 to 1965, she played against men, full court using men's rules. The Redheads and the Travelers were our first taste of professional women's basketball at that level. In 1955, the 3-second rule was added. Players in the offensive lane may not hold the ball for more than 3 seconds. And in 1966, they got the continuous dribble. In 1962, 2 whole rovers were allowed per team, and in 1971, full-court 5-player games were instituted for the first time for collegiate and AAU games. A 30-second shot clock was also implemented. Now the women are just playing with the rules they're allowed to play with, doing the best they can with whatever they're given. But in 1972, that all changed with Title IX. It was extremely game-changing. This basically just meant that the schools had to spend as much money on the women as they were spending on the men, which led to better conditions for basketball players. You're talking better jerseys, better practicing conditions, maybe access to some locker rooms, who knows. They got a much needed increase in the financial backing that was going on at the time. The first nationally televised women's basketball game was played by Maryland and Immaculata. So the funny thing is, we don't know the actual score. We just know that Immaculata won. In 1953, the first FIBA World Championship for women hits the scene and the USA takes home the gold. 1976, the first Olympic competition for women, and the USA takes home the silver in this one. By 1984, we're getting really serious here. The ball circumference for NCAA play is reduced by 1 inch to 28.5 compared to the ball previously used and the one being used by men, officially adopting the size 6 basketball. In 1987, the 3-point field goal is introduced, the line being set at 19 feet and 9 inches from the center of the basket. All that history and step-by-step women's basketball to say that basketball and women's basketball specifically has come a long way. We aren't even watching the same game at this point in history, but it proves its popularity. They were able to drop the cutesy and non-contact with a different ring than men's basketball. FIBA for women started in the 50s and kept on rolling. After Title IX, women's sports saw the financial backing it deserved. AAU and other collegiate programs were cashing in on the hot new sport, so it was only right that they got some type of backing there. You had the Ladies Professional Basketball Association from 1980 to 1981. They were formed as a rival league to the WBL when the WBL started having financial problems. The league was poorly organized and played only 5 5 games before disbanding with 3 teams that never even played a game. Then you also had the Liberty Basketball Association. They played 1 exhibition game before disbanding completely. You had the National Women's Basketball Association in 1986. They were able to sign Molly Bolin, who was a WBL star. They didn't even make it to the first regular season, folding in 1986, the same year they were founded. There was actually a league called the WBA. The Women's Basketball Association was the first women's professional basketball summer league. It ran from 1992 to 1995. They did have 3 successful seasons, so the WBA was the closest league to what the WNBA is today. It played during the summer league, and that was its main goal there. Fox Sports purchased Liberty Sports and the WBA. They dissolved the league shortly after and sold off the franchising rights. It was a pretty successful league, probably sold off prematurely. Enter Bill Brine. He founded the first professional women's basketball league in the United States, and they actually had a draft held in Manhattan in July in 1978. They had very few firm commitments from teams, from playing locations to ownerships. The league planned to play a 34-game season with teams in Chicago, Houston, Iowa, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, New Jersey, New York, and Washington, D.C. So starting off, you had pretty interesting situations. The New Jersey Gems selected Carol Blazejowski from Montclair State College, but she announced while on tour through her coach that she had no intention of playing professionally and that her goal was to retain her amateur standing to be able to play for the U.S. at the 1980 Summer Olympics. Similarly, Lucia Harris, a collegiate star at Delta State University, was selected by the Houston team, but was reluctant to commit after hearing the $3,000 to $5,000 salary estimated by the Minnesota franchise. The league played its first game on December 9th, 1978, between the Chicago Hustle and the Milwaukee Does at the Milwaukee Arena, with the league's inaugural game attracting 4 minutes of coverage in the previous night's CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. The Does had a crowd of 7,824 at the game, which saw the hometown team lose to Chicago. The league was divided into 2 divisions, with Chicago, Milwaukee, Iowa, and Minnesota playing in the Western Division, while Dayton, Houston, New Jersey, and New York were in the East. The 8 initial teams paid $50,000 for their franchise, while the 4 teams to be added in the 79-80 season were expected to pay $100,000 and $250,000 per team for each of the 4 more teams in the following season. They were actually able to put together an all-star game for 1979, which was played at Madison Square Garden with just under 3,000 fans. It was so hastily put together they had to play on a borrowed court from the United States Military Academy, forcing some of the players to make hectic travel arrangements just to get to their next regular season game. The East beat the Midwest. Rita Esterling of the Chicago Hustle was named the MVP of that first all-star game. Behind 36 points by Paula Mayo, the Houston Angels defeated the Iowa Hornets on May 2nd, 1979, to take the league's first championship. Going into the 79-80 season was okay. The Dayton Rockets had to be taken over by the league and were set for a relocation. Dallas, New Orleans, and St. Louis were awarded teams, and Baltimore, LA, Philly, and Washington, D.C. were applying for teams. So they still had some pretty good hope going on there. They held a 1980 All-Star game where the West beat the East. The New York Stars won the title that year, but immediately asked for 2 years off, which should have been a little bit of foreshadowing for what was going on in the league and what would come for the league. The 1980-1981 season marked the last for this trailblazing league. This year was plagued with problems. It started off tragic with Nebraska Wranglers losing a member of their team. The eventual champions would hear their teammate had gone missing and was later pronounced dead. In March of that year, the Minnesota Phillies, an original team for the league, walked off the court in protest of unpaid salaries. After it was clear they would not play, the commissioner at the time, Sherwin Fisher, suspended the team. The 1980 Olympics was an opportunity to showcase USA women's basketball as a country and as a league. Bill Brine was desperately hoping for the media and public's attention to his league. In a move he couldn't have seen until it was too late, the USA boycotted the Olympics that year for moral reasons. So much so that other countries did not attend the Olympics either. But this meant no showcase for his most talented players. A devastating blow to the league. league. The Nebraska Wranglers won the league's 1980-1981 title, defeating the Dallas Diamonds 3-2 in the fifth and final game, featuring players Nancy Lieberman and Pamela McGee. By the fall of 1981, Commissioner David Olmsted announced the league had disbanded, having generated $14 million in losses in its 3 years on the court. Olmsted had been trying unsuccessfully to contact the surviving 8 teams' investors and team owners. Owner of the Chicago Hustle insisted that he would field a team that would go barnstorming if the league went out of existence, and thought that the teams would be fielded for a 4th season by Chicago, Nebraska, and New Orleans. But unfortunately, that marked the demise of that league. With a little hope on the horizon, some of the players from this league were actually able to play for the next league, the WABA. Bill Bryan founded this league as well, Women's American Basketball Association. A second attempt at the failed WBL, the WABA was poorly organized and financed and lasted just 2 months, from October to December of 1984. 3 of the league's 6 clubs, Atlanta, Columbus, and Virginia, disbanded shortly after Thanksgiving, leading to the league's early demise. A handful of hastily rescheduled games were played among the surviving Chicago, Dallas, and Houston clubs in early December. Eventually, league owners decided that the previously scheduled WABA All-Star Game at Dallas on December 16th would serve as the final game for the season. The Dallas Diamonds were far and away the league's best club, rolling up a 21-2 record. In that final game, the Diamonds defeated a WABA All-Star team consisting of players from each of the other 5 clubs by a score of 101-94. They played in front of an estimated crowd of 1,500 people at Moody Coliseum in Dallas, Texas. The WABA would never take the floor again. As late as August of 1985, the Dallas Diamonds owner was still being quoted to seeking expansion teams and franchises for the 85-86 WABA season. He was cited confirming that franchises in Chicago, Dallas, Denver, Houston, and the northern Indiana areas were willing to put up franchises for the league. November training camps and an opening day of December 5th, 1985 for the WABA's second year was set, but unfortunately those plans never came to pass, and it marked the end of that second league. Notable stars from this league would include Nancy Lieberman and Pamela McGee of the Dallas Diamonds, and Molly Bolin of the Columbus Minks. I also just find it funny that the Dallas Diamonds existed in both of these leagues. He really liked that name. What a time for women's basketball. The 1996 Summer Olympic Games showcased to the world the USA women's basketball team, and they took home the gold. The American Basketball League, or the ABL, correctly predicted the gold medal win and wanted to capitalize on the attention women's basketball had on it. Founded in 1995, the league would limp through both the 96-97 and 97-98 seasons before declaring bankruptcy in December of 1998. The ABL was actually strategic starting out. The Yukon Huskies had a perfect national championship season with the 35-0 record. Attention on women's basketball was very high at the time. The league was built around Olympic players and boasted on its high salaries. This pretty much guaranteed the best quality women's basketball was with the ABL. They had teams like the Atlanta Glory, the Long Beach Stingrays, Chicago Condors, and Nashville Noise. Just making a note at how awesome these team names were. The ABL played during the same time of year as the NBA, so being heavily underfunded and decreased attention led to the demise of this league. It was an excellent showcase for some of the best women players at the time, and while it did try and capitalize on the popularity, it just wasn't enough. The ABL lasted 2 full seasons, 1996 to 1997 and 1997 to 1998. The Atlanta Glory and Long Beach Stingrays folded prior to the start of the 98-99 season and were replaced by 2 expansion teams, the Chicago Condors and the Nashville Noise. On December 22, 1999, with almost no warning, the ABL declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy and suspended operations. Each team had played between 12 and 15 games of the 1998-99 season. The ABL got off the ground before the WNBA, and at least early on its quality of play was higher than the rival league. This was partly due to the league's signing of a majority of the 1996 USA women's national team. Although the WNBA was bankrolled by the NBA, the ABL offered higher salaries. The 2 leagues did not compete directly. The ABL played during the winter while the WNBA played during the summer. The WNBA actually encouraged its players players to try to play for the ABL. The ABL played during the winter while the WNBA played during the summer. However, this arrangement put the ABL in direct competition with the established men's NBA for an audience. Ultimately, the ABL found the WNBA's stronger financial resources, augmented by the NBA's marketing machine, to be too much to overcome. The league operated as a single entity structure, which was intended to control costs until it found its feet. However, it also meant that even the most basic decisions related to team operations had to go through the league office itself. The ABL was crazy underfunded. Of all the ABL cities, Chicago, Seattle, and Atlanta now have WNBA teams. Notable players from the ABL that either went on to play in the WNBA or still hold some tie to women's basketball: Tanya Edwards is now the head coach at Alcorn State University. Kate Pay is an assistant coach at Stanford University. Jennifer Rizzotti is now the president of the Connecticut Sun. Kate Smith is an assistant coach for the Minnesota Lynx. Charlotte Smith is a head coach at Elon University. Don Staley is the head coach at USC. Natalie Williams is the general manager of the Las Vegas Aces. Women's basketball has come a long way in the USA, starting with a game completely unrecognizable compared to today. I mean, seriously, 18 players on the court and no one can touch each other, let alone run. When I think about dribbling being prohibited, I know I'm thinking about a completely different game. The WNBA is the big league in the room, and it's only growing at this point. Multiple Olympic gold medalists, very entertaining players and personalities, but that also means more tries at competition leagues. More specifically, players wanting a bigger piece of their well-deserved pie. Both Athletes Unlimited and the Unrivaled leagues are player-led and player-owned women's basketball leagues, giving them a lot of control of their WNBA off-seasons, as well as opportunities to those not in the league. Athletes Unlimited will host its 4th season this year in Nashville, and it's gaining popularity with its leaderboard format of play. Unrivaled is set to debut in January of 2025 and already have committed superstars to their league. Their league will feature a 3-on-3 format, but it's still women's basketball all the same. The WNBA is here to stay, especially being the longest running league and most heavily backed in comparison. I see these other leagues being popular in their lane. It's still women's basketball, but not in direct competition with the WNBA. As a fan, we love to see the rise in competition and level of play, showing just how far we've come with women's basketball. Thank you for watching. You are appreciated, and I am wishing you the day you deserve.